All right, everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive. Today, we're going to tackle the Big Bang Theory. But get this, our source material is actually an English language learning podcast.
Oh, wow. That's an interesting twist.
Right. But don't worry, if you're not a physics whiz, we'll make sure everything's clear. Plus, you might just learn some cool new words along the way.
Exactly. It's amazing how language and science can intersect like that, right?
Totally. So in this podcast, we meet a student who's really struggling with their physics class. In fact, they even call it a killer subject. Oof, I think we've all been there at some point, right? Like that one subject that just makes your head spin.
Oh, absolutely. Physics does deal with some pretty big concepts like the Big Bang Theory, which tries to explain the origin of the whole universe.
Yeah, but it's important to remember, as the podcast points out, that it is just a theory.
Right, exactly. And that word theory, it can be a bit tricky because it means something different in science than it does in everyday conversation.
So you're saying that when scientists talk about a theory, it's not just a random guess.
Exactly. In science, a theory is a well-supported explanation, backed up by tons of evidence. It's been rigorously tested and it's held up under scrutiny.
So it's more like almost a proven fact, right?
Well, you could put it that way. But the thing is, science is always evolving, so even our best theories can be refined or even completely changed with new evidence.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, the student in the podcast, they seem a bit skeptical about the Big Bang. They even compare it to that old myth about Atlas holding up the world, which I thought was kind of a clever comparison, actually.
It is. I think it really shows how, throughout history, humans have always tried to find explanations for how the universe works, whether through myths or religion or science. And the Big Bang Theory, that's just our best current attempt based on the evidence.
All right, so how does this theory actually explain the creation of everything, like the whole universe?
So imagine, right, the universe starts from an incredibly hot, dense state, like billions of years ago, 13.8 billion to be exact. And from that point, it just starts expanding. And guess what? It's still expanding today.
Wow, okay, so how do we even know that's happening?
Well, there's things like the redshift of distant galaxies, which shows that they're moving away from us.
Right, okay, I'm starting to get the picture now. But what about all this stuff in the universe? The matter. Where did all that come from?
Now, that's where things get really mind-blowing. The Big Bang Theory suggests that basically all the matter came from an imbalance between particles and antiparticles. And this all happened in fractions of a second after the Big Bang.
Particles and antiparticles. Okay, I think I've heard those terms before, but could you explain what those are exactly?
Sure. Imagine you're on a beach, right? And there are countless grains of sand. Each grain, that's a particle. And for every particle, there's an antiparticle, kind of like its opposite twin. And when these two collide, poof, they annihilate each other, releasing a ton of energy.
So it's like a cosmic battle between matter and antimatter.
Exactly. And in the early universe, there was just this tiny, tiny bit more matter than antimatter. And that tiny imbalance, well, that's why we have all the stuff we see today. You, me, stars, planets, everything.
Wow, that is mind-blowing. And the podcast mentions this drift of matter. Is that connected to this whole expanding universe thing?
You got it. It basically means that everything's still moving outwards from that initial Big Bang point. So it's like the evidence, the proof that the universe is expanding.
Okay, so it's like the aftermath of a giant explosion that's still rippling outward billions of years later.
Yeah, precisely. And this idea, it wasn't just speculation. This guy, Edwin Hubble, an astronomer, he actually observed this in the early 20th century. He measured the redshift of galaxies, and that's how we know for sure that they're moving away from us.
Huh, interesting. Now, the podcast also talks about how people tout the Big Bang Theory, which makes it sound like some sort of marketing campaign.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. To tout means to, really promote something enthusiastically. And in this context, I think it suggests that maybe some people are oversimplifying the Big Bang Theory. Maybe not addressing all the nuances and complexities surrounding it.
So like someone trying to sell you the latest fad diet or gadget or something.
Exactly. And even with a well-established theory like the Big Bang, it's important to, be critical, think for yourself, and not just accept everything you hear at face value.
Right, exactly. And that brings us to another word from the podcast, rigor. The student asks, where's the rigor? When people are just blindly touting these theories. And it's a good point, right?
Absolutely. Rigor in science, it basically means using strict and precise methods to test a theory. So, it's not just about coming up with an idea, it's about actually testing it, collecting data, and being open to revising your ideas if they don't hold up.
Right, so it's like that saying, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Exactly. And rigor, it's not just a science thing either. It can apply to anything, any field where you need to be careful and precise, like writing or research, or even just making a big decision.
So I could say, I'm approaching this project with rigor if I'm being super careful and paying attention to all the detail.
Exactly. It shows that you're being thorough and dedicated to quality.
Okay, got it. Now, it sounds like our physics student in the podcast might not be approaching their studies with much rigor. They clearly didn't do the reading, which leads to this funny moment where they try to equivocate.
Yes, the classic tactic of avoiding a straight answer. You see it all the time, like in politics especially.
Like when a politician is asked a tough question and they just dance around it without actually saying anything concrete.
Exactly. That's equivocating, trying to sound smart without actually committing to a position. And our podcast student, their attempt at it is just a little reminder that sometimes it's better to just admit you don't know something.
Good point. Now back to the Big Bang. Surprised to learn that it's actually a pretty controversial topic, even banned in some schools.
Yeah, it is. It's interesting how, a scientific idea can become so entangled with social and cultural beliefs.
So in some places, teachers aren't even allowed to talk about the Big Bang Theory.
Yeah, in some U.S. schools, it's actually prohibited. It's a complex issue, and there are, various reasons for this. Some people believe that the Big Bang contradicts their religious beliefs about creation, for example.
Right, so it's not just about the science itself, but about how it might clash with other belief systems.
Exactly. And while we're not here to, debate those beliefs, it's important to just acknowledge those different perspectives. Our focus is on the science and the language, not taking sides.
Well said. And speaking of language, the podcast uses some fun slang terms that I think are worth highlighting, like killer, math, schmath, and duh.
Oh yeah, those are great examples. So when the student says physics is killer, they mean it's super difficult, right? Like ridiculously hard.
Yeah, exactly, like saying something is wicked hard or crazy tough.
And then there's math, schmath. That's like saying math is unimportant or just dismissing it as boring.
It's like saying work schmilk when you're feeling super lazy.
Exactly. And then duh, that one's used to point out something that's, totally obvious.
And often sarcastically, right? Like, Dad, no kidding.
You got it.
Yeah.
It's just a fun way to emphasize how obvious something is.
It's amazing how these little slang words can add so much personality to the language. Anyway, let's dive back into some of the more technical terms from the podcast, like matter, particles, and antiparticles. Those can be tricky to grasp, even if you're not, brand new to physics.
Oh, for sure. Okay, so matter is basically anything that has mass and takes up space. It's the physical stuff of the universe, like the things we can see and touch.
Our bodies, the air we breathe, the planets, the stars, it's all matter.
Exactly. Now, particles are like the tiny building blocks of matter. Think of them as like the smallest units that still have the properties of an element.
So like, if matter was a giant Lego structure, particles would be the individual Lego bricks.
Perfect analogy. And then you have antiparticles, which are basically mirror images of particles. They have the same mass, but the opposite electric charge.
Okay, so for every electron which has a negative charge, there's a positron with a positive charge.
You got it. And remember, when a particle and its antiparticle meet, they annihilate each other, releasing energy. Sounds crazy, right? But that's particle physics for you.
Wow, that is wild. Okay, so the podcast also uses some other big words, thus and notion. Those can sound a little intimidating, especially if you're not used to reading academic stuff.
Oh, they're not too bad once you break them down. Thus basically means therefore or as a result. It's like a connector word that shows a cause and effect relationship.
So instead of saying, I was tired, so I went to bed early, I could say, I was tired, thus I went to bed early.
Exactly. It sounds a bit more formal and sophisticated.
I like it. Okay, what about notion? What does that one mean?
Notion is just a fancy way of saying idea or concept, like a belief or understanding about something.
So if I have a notion that the earth is flat, it means I believe that, even though it's been proven wrong.
Exactly. And in the podcast, they use the phrase, thus advancing notions of an expanding universe. So what that means is that the evidence, the drift of matter that we talked about, it supports the idea of an expanding universe. It helps to, solidify that concept.
Okay, that makes sense. I'm feeling a little smarter already. But you know what? Maybe it's time to take a break from all the technical stuff and just play around with those slang terms again. They're just so catchy.
I'm game. Language is supposed to be fun, right? Let's see, how can we use those words in a more everyday setting?
I know. Imagine you're at a party and someone brings out a plate of, like, the most amazing looking cookies. You'd be like, whoa, those cookies look killer. I gotta try one.
Perfect. It really gets across how good those cookies look.
Or let's say your friend is stressing out about a math test. You could say, like, math, schmath, just relax and do your best.
Haha, yeah. A good way to lighten the mood.
And then if someone asks you a super obvious question like, is the sky blue? You could hit him with a sarcastic, duh, have you ever even looked up?
Exactly. It's all about being playful with language.
For sure. But, I'm still kind of stuck on the fact that teaching the Big Bang is actually controversial in some places.
It's a reminder that science, especially when it comes to the origins of the universe, can be a sensitive topic for some people.
It's wild to me that in some schools in the US, it's actually forbidden to even teach the Big Bang.
Yeah, it's a complex issue with a lot of historical and cultural baggage. Some people see it as a direct conflict with their religious beliefs, and that can create a lot of tension.
Right, so it's not always a simple discussion about science versus religion, but about how different belief systems intersect and sometimes clash.
Exactly. And while we're not going to get into the weeds of those debates, it's important to just acknowledge that these different perspectives exist and to be respectful of that. Our goal here is to explore the science and the language, not to take sides.
Well said. Okay, before we move on, I think it's worth quickly revisiting that distinction between a scientific theory and how we use the word theory in everyday conversation, just to make sure everyone's on the same page.
Absolutely. It's a crucial difference. As we said before, in science, a theory is a well-substantiated explanation that has been rigorously tested and supported by a lot of evidence. It's not just a random guess or a hunch.
It's like the highest level of certainty we could achieve in science, right?
Pretty much. It's like the gold standard. It represents the culmination of years, often decades, of research and experimentation.
But in our everyday language, theory is used much more loosely.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Like, I have a theory about why my neighbor's dog barks all night. That's not exactly a scientific theory, is it?
Right. It's more like speculation or a personal opinion, not based on any hard evidence.
Exactly. So when we talk about the Big Bang Theory, we need to remember we're talking about it in the scientific sense. It's an explanation that's been rigorously tested and backed up by a mountain of evidence.
Got it. So while there might be controversy surrounding it, the Big Bang Theory isn't just some random idea that someone pulled out of thin air. It's the result of a lot of hard work by brilliant minds who have dedicated their lives to understanding how the universe works.
Exactly. And like any scientific theory, it's always subject to revision and refinement as new data emerges. That's the beauty of science. It's always evolving and seeking to deepen our understanding.
And that's why it's so exciting. It means there's always more to discover, more to learn, and more to wonder about.
For sure. So even though we've learned a lot about the Big Bang today, it's really just the beginning of the journey. There's still so much we don't know, and that's what keeps scientists pushing the boundaries of knowledge.
I love that. The universe is full of mysteries, just waiting to be unraveled. But for now, let's take a little break and come back to those unanswered questions and fascinating points from the podcast that we haven't had a chance to fully explore yet.
Sounds good to me.
All right, we'll be right back after a short break. Okay, so we're back and ready to continue our deep dive into the Big Bang Theory. It really makes you realize how much we still don't know about the universe.
Oh, absolutely. It's humbling, isn't it? All these mysteries out there just waiting to be discovered.
For sure. So let's take a minute to kind of recap what we've learned so far. I mean, who knew that an English language learning podcast would lead us to a discussion about, like, the origins of the universe?
Right. We definitely went beyond just basic vocabulary this time.
We did. We actually, dug into the core ideas behind the Big Bang. That initial singularity, the expansion, the formation of matter. I even think I finally understand what particles and antiparticles are, which is a big win in my book.
Haha, definitely a win. And we can't forget those slang terms killer, math, schmath, and duh. It's funny how those little words can really add some color to a conversation about, complex science.
Right. It's a reminder that language doesn't always have to be so serious and formal. But, beyond just the terminology, I think we also touched on something really important, the idea of critical thinking.
Oh, absolutely.
All right.
Especially when it comes to topics like the Big Bang, which can be controversial.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, learning that some schools actually banned teaching it was kind of mind-blowing.
It is. It shows how, scientific ideas can sometimes bump up against personal beliefs, and that can create some challenges.
For sure. And, while we didn't really dive into those specific debates, I think it's important to at least acknowledge those different perspectives.
Mhm.
Like you said earlier, our goal here isn't to take sides, but to equip our listeners with the knowledge and the vocabulary to understand the complexities of these topics.
Exactly. We're just providing the tools. It's up to each individual to then, explore those ideas further and form their own opinions.
Right, to continue the journey, so to speak. And speaking of continuing the journey, I think it's time to leave our listeners with a little something to ponder, something to spark their curiosity and keep them thinking even after the episode is over.
All right, I like that. So here's a thought-provoking question. If the Big Bang Theory is our current best explanation for the universe's origins, what other possibilities might exist? Could there be alternative theories out there just waiting to be discovered, theories that might completely change our understanding of how it all began?
Ooh, that is a good one. It's a reminder that science is always evolving and that there's always more to learn and discover. Who knows? Maybe one of our listeners will be the one to uncover those answers someday.
I love that thought. Yeah, it's a truly vast and mysterious universe out there, isn't it?
It really is.
Yeah.
And the Big Bang Theory, it's like our best roadmap so far, but it definitely doesn't answer all the questions.
Oh, for sure. Not even close. There's so much we're still figuring out.
Yeah, exactly. Remember all those fascinating bits from the podcast that we didn't really get to dig into? Like that whole idea of the drift of matter?
Yeah.
It's like, whoa, hold on a minute. What exactly does that mean?
Right. That phrase, it really captures the idea that the universe is constantly expanding, even now.
So it's not just a one-time explosion and that's it. It's like, it's still going.
Yep, exactly. Matter and radiation, they're still moving outwards from that initial point. Kind of like, imagine ripples spreading across a pond.
Okay, I can picture that. So it's like the universe is always in motion.
Absolutely. And we know this isn't just, some made-up idea. There's actual evidence to support it. Things like, well, think about the redshift of distant galaxies.
Oh, right. We talked about that earlier. It's like proof that they're moving away from us.
Exactly. So picture this. The universe is like a giant balloon that's constantly being inflated, and everything in it, including us, is just along for the ride.
Wow, that's kind of a crazy thought.
It is. And this whole idea, the expanding universe, it was a pretty revolutionary discovery back in the day, like in the early 20th century. And we owe a lot of that to this guy, Edwin Hubble, an astronomer.
Yeah, the podcast mentioned him, right? He was like the first one to actually measure this whole drift of matter thing.
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
He used these really powerful telescopes to look at distant galaxies, and he was able to measure their redshift. And that was basically the confirmation, the evidence that the universe is indeed expanding.
Huh. That's pretty amazing. So it's like his work really solidified the Big Bang Theory, like it made it even more believable.
Oh, absolutely. He was a true pioneer in the field of cosmology. And to this day, his observations and discoveries continue to shape our understanding of the universe.
So it's like, thanks to him, we have a much clearer picture of how things work on a cosmic scale.
Right. Now, another thing the podcast touched on that I think is really interesting is the whole concept of rigorous testing in science.
Oh yeah, that was pretty intense. Like the level of scrutiny that these theories have to go through.
It's like the ultimate test. Rigor in science. It means being extremely thorough, precise, and careful when you're testing a theory. It's not just about coming up with a cool idea, you have to really put it through the ringer.
So it's like you can't just say something and expect everyone to believe it. You have to actually prove it, right?
Exactly. Scientists are like detectives, they're constantly gathering evidence, running experiments, trying to figure out what's really going on. And this whole process of rigorous testing, that's what gives scientific theories their weight, their credibility.
So when we talk about the Big Bang Theory, it's not like we're just talking about some random guess or something. It's gone through all these tests and it's still standing strong.
Right, exactly. It's not just speculation. It's based on solid evidence, tons of data, years of research. Countless scientists have worked on this, testing it, refining it, and so far it's held up pretty well.
Okay, that makes me feel a lot more confident about it, actually. Like, it's not just some made-up story. It's grounded in, real science.
Exactly. And, even though we've come a long way in our understanding of the universe, the beauty of science is that it's always evolving. So there's always room for new discoveries and new questions.
And that's what keeps it so exciting, right? There's always something more to learn.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think we did a pretty good job of breaking down the Big Bang Theory today, wouldn't you say?
Oh, I think so. We covered a lot of ground, from the actual science to the language and even some of the controversies and philosophical stuff. It's been a true deep dive.
And we had them fun along the way.
Right.
Like, who knew that talking about physics could involve slang words, and personal stories.
I know. Sometimes you got to keep things lighthearted, especially when you're dealing with like really big ideas. It helps to make it all more, relatable and understandable.
Exactly. So to all our listeners out there, I hope this episode has sparked your curiosity and inspired you to keep learning and exploring. Remember, there's a whole universe out there just waiting to be discovered, and who knows, maybe one of you listening will be the one to make the next groundbreaking discovery.
I love that thought. Keep those minds curious, keep asking those big questions, and never stop learning.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Until next time, folks, keep diving deep.